The first thing I remember is the sound of rain tapping against the old tin roof of my father's house. It was a slow and steady sound, the kind that used to make me feel safe when I was little. But that night it was different. It was sharp, cold. Every drop felt like a countdown I could not stop. My head was pressed against the hardwood floor, just a few inches away from the oak cabinet I had slammed into when Mark shoved me. I could not feel the pain yet. It was as if my body had gone quiet before my mind caught up. The living room light was dim, flickering slightly, like it had done for years when the rain came down heavy. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my breath thin and uneven, and the copper taste of blood rising at the back of my throat. The smell hit me next. It was iron and oak and the rich burn of red wine. Mark was sitting across from me in my father's old armchair. My father never let anyone else sit in that chair, but Mark did. He always did. His shirt sleeves were rolled up and streaks of my blood ran down his right hand. It was still fresh enough to shine under the weak light. His fingers were wrapped around the stem of a wine glass, tilting it slowly in small circles. The deep red liquid swirled with a lazy rhythm like a predator who had already caught what it came for. I blinked, trying to keep my eyes open. The room swam in and out of focus. My ribs ached from the fall. My scalp throbbed where it had struck the cabinet. Mark raised the glass to eye level and studied it like an artist admiring his own work. My blood had smeared across the side of the glass where his fingers touched it. Then, as if nothing was wrong, he brought it to his lips and took a slow drink. A drop of blood slid off his index finger and fell into the wine. He watched it dissolve like it belonged there. His eyes were empty. I used to think cruelty looked loud and violent, but that night it looked like quiet satisfaction. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, relaxed as if he were at some private dinner party. His voice was calm, almost soft. "From now on, Clara," he whispered, "it's all mine." Something cracked inside me then. Not the kind of crack you can hear, but the kind that splits through your chest like glass under pressure. I wanted to scream, but my throat refused to work. The blood pooling beneath my shoulder felt warm against the cold floorboards. In the far corner of the room, the small black speaker I had set up months ago blinked with a red light. It looked harmless. Just a speaker. But inside it was a camera and a microphone. And it was recording everything. His bloody hands, his voice, his calm, his claim. My vision blurred again. My breath came in shallow pulls. I could see movement in the hallway. Diane. My mother. She stood half hidden in the shadows, hands pressed against her chest. She did not move toward me. She did not speak. She just stood there, trembling like someone watching a storm they had chosen not to stop. For a second, our eyes met. Hers were glassy and terrified, but not for me. For herself. She knew what Mark was capable of. She always had. That was the cruelest part. I tried to lift my hand to press against the floor, but my arm barely twitched. The air tasted metallic. The chandelier above me blurred into a gold halo. Mark swirled the glass again, letting out a small hum. It was not a song. It was something worse. Contentment. He looked at me again with that hollow calm and said, "You never should have come back here." Outside, thunder rolled across the Virginia sky. The wind slammed against the porch, but inside the house it was silent. Not the silence of peace, the silence of ownership, the kind of silence that belongs to the person who thinks they have already won. I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the same clock my father wound every Sunday morning. Mark tapped the bottom of his glass against the armrest. Once. Twice. Like a metronome marking the moment he thought everything became his. My blood smeared along the floor in a thin line when I tried to shift my body. Pain hit me then. It came sharp and bright, making my breath hitch. My mouth filled with the taste of iron. The edges of the room softened again. Mark didn't move to help. Of course he didn't. He glanced toward Diane in the hallway, his lip curling into something that was not quite a smile. She lowered her eyes. I knew she would not call 911. She had made her choice years ago. My fingers brushed against the edge of the rug. I tried to keep my mind anchored, tried not to let the black edges closing in swallow me whole. Somewhere inside me, past the pain, past the betrayal, a single thought formed with perfect clarity. The tape is still rolling. The camera was catching every second. His voice, his hands, his glass, my blood. He had no idea. I stared at that blinking red light like it was a lifeline. It was small, almost invisible, but it was more loyal to me than anyone in that house. Mark finished his wine. He set the glass down on the table with a soft clink. He looked down at me one last time, his head tilted slightly like he was inspecting a stain on the floor. His voice was soft when he spoke. "This house was never yours." My lungs burned as I dragged in another breath. The chandelier blurred again, its light bending in the corners of my vision. Rain pounded against the roof. My heart beat hard but slow. I could hear it in my ears, a distant drum. Diane stepped back. I heard the faint squeak of the hallway floorboard. She vanished from sight. She did not say my name. She did not move toward the phone. She left me on the floor with the man who had taken everything. Mark leaned back again, folding his hands over his chest. The blood on his fingers had dried a little dark against his pale skin. He looked comfortable, satisfied. I wanted to believe I was still in control of something, even if it was just a thread. And I was. It was blinking in the corner, a red dot, a recording. That night, as the rain fell harder and the house sank into silence, I understood something I had never let myself say out loud. They were not my family, not anymore. The tape would not lie. My eyes slipped closed, not from surrender, but from a kind of cold certainty. He thought the house was his. He thought I was beaten. But the truth was already out of his hands and stored far away from him. As the darkness pulled me under, his last words echoed through the room like a seal on a claim. "From now on, Clara, it's all mine." He thought those words were the end. He was wrong. The tape was still rolling. When the envelope arrived, it looked like nothing more than another piece of mail, thin and white and ordinary. But the way my hands shook as I held it told me it was not ordinary at all. I had seen the return address printed in clean black ink before. It was the law firm my father had trusted for years. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten cereal before school as a little girl, and tore the edge open with the tip of my finger. I remember the quiet, the weight of it, the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me. When I unfolded the letter, the words stared up at me like they had been waiting all these years. My father's estate, probate finalized, the house officially transferred to me. My throat tightened. I traced the printed letters with my fingertip, reading the address I knew by heart. My father's name was still there in the heading, bold and clean, like he had signed it himself. I was the legal owner now. The house I had grown up in was mine. My father's house, not Mark's, not Diane's. Mine. But even in that moment, a part of me felt a cold wind crawl down my spine. Because good news in this house never stayed good for long. I heard the back door creak open before I had even finished reading the letter. Mark's boots thudded against the old wooden floor, slow and deliberate. He always walked like he owned the place. Diane followed a few steps behind, soft and hesitant like she always did. I folded the letter and tried to tuck it back into the envelope, but Mark was already standing behind me. His shadow fell across the kitchen table. "What's that?" he asked, his voice smooth and careful, like a man who already knows the answer. I held the letter tighter. "It's from the lawyer," I said. "About the house." His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Diane came around the corner and leaned on the counter, avoiding my eyes. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "You should have told us you got something." That word. Us. It slid like a knife between my ribs. I unfolded the letter again and laid it flat on the table. My hand didn't shake anymore. It was steady. "The house is legally mine now," I said. The words came out quiet, but they filled the room. I watched Mark's jaw tighten just enough for me to notice. He leaned down close enough for me to smell the faint burn of whiskey on his breath. "That's nice," he said slowly. "But you know houses are a lot to manage. Taxes, maintenance, insurance. You might not want to deal with that alone." I looked up at him and saw it. Not surprise, not disappointment. Calculation. He had been waiting for this moment. Diane touched his arm gently like she always did when she thought she could soften him. "Maybe we should all talk about what's best for everyone," she said. Everyone. I had been erased from my own home long before this letter came. After my father died, Mark had slowly moved in like a creeping shadow. At first it was his boots by the door, then his toolbox in the garage, then the armchair in the living room that he claimed like a throne. By the time I moved back after college, it didn't feel like my father's house anymore. It felt like Mark's domain, and my mother moved through it like a ghost. I looked down at the legal language on the paper and held on to the only solid thing I had left. "The house is mine," I said again, firmer this time. "I'm not signing it over." The kitchen light flickered as thunder rolled outside. Mark's fingers drummed on the table once, twice, slow and deliberate. He lowered himself into the chair across from me, like a man taking his place at the head of the table. "Clara," he said, drawing out my name like he owned it. "You're young. You don't know what goes into something like this. You can't handle a property like this on your own." "I don't need your help," I said. His smile returned thin and cold. "We'll see." Diane sighed quietly, that familiar sound of surrender. She didn't look at me. She hadn't really looked at me for years. She had chosen Mark over me so many times it wasn't even a choice anymore. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Mark's eyes followed the movement like a predator watching prey. "We should all talk," Diane repeated, but it sounded like a plea. Not to me, to him. He stood up first, towering over me, his boots creaking against the floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than a shout. "You're not going to make this difficult, are you?" he asked. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. My father used to stand in that exact spot and read the newspaper every morning. He used to whistle while the coffee brewed. I could still see him in flashes when the light hit just right. But now it was Mark standing there, and everything felt wrong. I gripped the envelope until the paper crumpled in my hand. "I'm keeping the house," I said. End of story. His eyes narrowed just slightly enough to make the hair on the back of my neck rise. Then he smiled again, that same quiet smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Nothing's ever the end of the story, Clara," he said. He walked away without looking back, his boots heavy on the floor. Diane lingered a moment, her hand resting on the counter. "You could make this easier," she whispered. "For everyone." I stared at her and saw the woman who used to braid my hair before school, the woman who once cried when my father died, the woman who had become a shadow. "For him, you mean," I said. She flinched but didn't deny it. Then she followed him disappearing into the hallway. The sound of the rain outside grew louder. I sat alone at the table, the letter still in my hand. My father's house, my name, my fight. In that moment, I didn't know how far Mark would go, but I felt it like a cold wind creeping through the cracks in the windows. Something had shifted. He wasn't going to let this go. It started slowly, almost too quietly to notice. That was the way Mark always did things. He never stormed in like a stranger trying to take control. He seeped into the spaces like smoke until one day the air just belonged to him. The first thing to go was my father's reading room. It was the one place in the house that had stayed exactly the same since the day he died. My father's old leather chair still faced the bay window. His shelves still held rows of weathered books with tiny handwritten notes inside. The oak desk still had his coffee ring stains. One afternoon I came home from work and found the door wide open. Boxes were stacked outside, taped shut. Inside, the walls were bare. The books were gone. The desk was pushed out to the garage. Mark was in the middle of the room, holding a power drill, whistling. "What are you doing?" I asked. He turned toward me slowly, like he had every right to be there. "Making it better," he said. "This place has been stuck in the past for too long." My father's reading room was not stuck. It was memory. It was the sound of him flipping pages and the smell of tobacco and ink. It was where I sat on the floor while he read stories about places I thought I'd see someday, and Mark was erasing it with a cordless drill. I stepped inside and looked around. The faint outlines of where the pictures used to hang were still on the wall like ghosts. "Put it back," I said. He smiled a thin smile. "It's my house too," he said. My throat tightened, but I couldn't find the words to fight him then. By the end of the day, the room was empty. He had moved his hunting trophies in by nightfall. My father's books never returned to the shelves. 2 weeks later, it was the living room. My father's old armchair, the one that smelled like cedar and always held the shape of his body, was suddenly at the dump. Mark said it was too old. The truth was, it belonged to someone who wasn't him. He replaced it with a leather recliner he ordered online, the kind that looked expensive but had no soul. Diane stood beside him when it arrived. She said nothing when I asked where the chair went. She didn't have to. Her silence was already an answer. After that came the photographs. My father had covered the hallway with black and white photos he'd taken himself. Fishing trips, backyard barbecues, birthdays. He was always behind the camera, but somehow always present in the frame. One afternoon, I walked down the hallway and every frame was gone. Not just taken down. Gone. The walls were stripped bare and freshly painted, a color I never chose. I found the photographs later in a box in the basement wrapped in old newspaper like junk. When I confronted Diane, she said, "We're just redecorating." Redecorating was Mark's word. Erasing was mine. Then came the garage. My father's tools were organized carefully on the wall. Every hammer, every wrench had its place. Mark sold half of it online without asking. They were collecting dust, he said. He replaced them with things I didn't recognize. The house started to look like him. It smelled like him. I felt like a guest in the place where I learned how to ride a bike in the driveway. One night, I overheard him on the phone. His voice was low, but I recognized the edge in it. "Once she signs, it's ours," he said. "All of it." My chest went cold. He wasn't just rearranging the house. He was stripping away everything that tethered it to me and my father. Diane must have heard it too, but she never said a word. She moved through the house like someone tiptoeing around a sleeping animal, hoping it would not wake. When I tried to fight back, it was like throwing pebbles at a wall. I asked about the reading room. Mark said it was outdated. I asked about the chair. He said it was falling apart. I asked about the photographs. He said, "Nobody wants to live in a museum." His smile always followed the last word. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that let me know he thought he was winning. And for a long time, he was. Even the smell of the house changed. My father's scent had always been a mix of cedarwood and pipe tobacco. One day, I came home and all I could smell was Mark's aftershave. It was everywhere. It soaked into the carpets and the walls until it drowned everything else out. It was like the house was being rewritten line by line until nothing of the original story was left. One night, after everyone went to bed, I went into the basement with a flashlight and opened the boxes. My father's things were crammed in like they didn't matter. I ran my hand over the spines of his books. I pressed my fingers against the frames of the photos. My chest ached like something inside me was being buried alive. Upstairs, I could hear Mark's footsteps. Even when he wasn't in the room, it felt like he was. His voice, his smell, his hand on everything that had once belonged to my father. I sat on the concrete floor and whispered, "I won't let you have it." My voice was too small, but in that moment, it was all I had. Mark's plan wasn't loud. It was patient. That was the most dangerous part. He didn't need to shout. He just needed to keep erasing until one day there was nothing left of my father's house except his name on the doorbell, and me standing in the middle with nowhere else to go. It wasn't just things he took away. It was the feeling of belonging. Every time he replaced a piece of my father with something of his own, the house stopped feeling like home. It started to feel like a trap. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain, the same rain that had always made me feel safe as a child. But this time, it sounded different. It sounded like it was washing away everything that was left of him. And for the first time, I understood. He wasn't just taking a house. He was erasing a history. My history. The rain had stopped the morning they told me to meet them at the lawyer's office. The air still smelled like wet pavement, sharp and clean, but there was nothing clean about what was waiting for me inside. Diane called it a simple meeting. Mark called it just paperwork. I knew better. Every time Mark lowered his voice into that soft, measured tone, it meant there was a plan underneath it. I stood outside the building longer than I should have, clutching the thin manila folder that held the letter naming me the legal owner of the house. My fingers were cold, even though it wasn't. Inside, everything smelled like polished wood and old coffee. The receptionist smiled politely and pointed me to the conference room down the hall. The moment I opened the door, Mark was already sitting at the head of the table like it belonged to him. Diane sat beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap. The lawyer was someone I didn't recognize. Not my father's lawyer, his, Mark's. He was a tall man with thin glasses and an expensive watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. Mark leaned back and the chair legs crossed the picture of control. "Clara," he said smoothly, "glad you could join us." I sat across from him, the only seat left at the long table. I could feel the weight of their arrangement pressing against me before anyone said a word. The lawyer began with a rehearsed smile. "We're here today to talk about the future of the Reynolds property," he said. "Your father left the home to you, but there are some practical considerations we should all discuss." Practical. That was the first lie of the morning. Mark tapped his finger against a stack of papers. "We want to make sure things don't get complicated," he added. "This is about protecting the family." Family. He loved that word. It was the word he used to make theft sound like tradition. I unfolded the letter and laid it on the table between us. "The house is mine," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The lawyer nodded politely. "Of course. But as your parents—" "He's not my parent," I cut in. My eyes never left Mark's face. His smile didn't falter, but something behind it shifted. A tiny flicker of anger, sharp and quick like a blade under a napkin. "Stepfather," the lawyer corrected smoothly. "As your family, they'd like to help manage the property. Taxes, upkeep, insurance. It's a lot for one person." "I don't need their help," I said. Diane's hand brushed Mark's arm as if to calm him, but he didn't need calming. He was enjoying this. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Clara, this house has been in the family for years. It wouldn't be right to divide things. You know how your father wanted us to stick together. My father never wanted him here. He tolerated him for my mother's sake, but the house had always been mine." I felt my hands tighten around the edge of the table. "What my father wanted is written in that letter," I said, "not in whatever story you're trying to tell." The lawyer slid a sheet of paper toward me. "This is a transfer of title agreement," he said gently, like he was talking to someone who didn't understand the words. "It would allow Mark and Diane to be listed as co-owners to ease the financial burden and legal responsibilities on you. It's a very standard arrangement." Mark folded his hands and tilted his head, his eyes locked on mine. "We're trying to make this easy," he said. I looked down at the paper. The legal language was cold and tight. All it needed was my signature. One signature, and everything my father had built would belong to him. Diane spoke softly, almost pleading. "Sweetheart, we just want to help. It's not good for you to handle all this alone." She wouldn't meet my eyes. She hadn't for a long time. I pushed the paper back toward them without touching the pen. "No." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Clara, it's important to think about what's practical here. Home ownership is complicated." "No," I said again, louder this time. Mark's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly like a man trying to keep his temper in check. "Clara, don't make this ugly. You're better than that." My heart pounded hard enough to feel it in my throat. It was strange how small that room felt with just the three of us sitting there. Diane shifted in her seat. Mark leaned even closer, his voice dropping into something lower and more dangerous. "Good daughters don't tear their family apart," he said. "Good daughters know when to do the right thing." I stared at him. The room around me seemed to blur, but his face was sharp. I thought about the reading room he had emptied, the chair he had thrown away, the photographs he had stripped from the walls. Good daughters. That was never what he wanted. He wanted ownership, control. "I'm not signing," I said. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mark's hand slammed down on the table flat and hard. Diane flinched. I didn't. His voice was still quiet, but now the mask had cracked just enough for the venom to show through. You're making a mistake. No, I said. I'm protecting what's mine. The lawyer cleared his throat again this time with less confidence. The room felt heavier. Mark sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the wood. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. I picked up the letter and stood. We're done, I said. Diane whispered my name, but it sounded small and far away. Mark smiled again, that same thin smile he wore the day the photographs disappeared. You'll regret this, he said. But I didn't look back. I walked out of that conference room with my father's letter clutched to my chest. The air outside was damp and cold, but it felt real, sharp, alive. Mark believed he could wear me down. He believed if he spoke softly enough and wrapped his greed in the word family, I would fold like Diane did. He was wrong. I knew something had cracked that day, but it wasn't me. It was the part of him that thought I would always be small. I drove across town that night with the letter still in my bag and the weight of Mark's smile pressing against my chest like a brick. The rain had started again, light and steady, coating the windshield with streaks of water that blurred the headlights of passing cars. Richmond was quiet at that hour. The streets felt smaller than usual, like the whole world had narrowed to a single point. I didn't go home. Home wasn't really home anymore. I drove to the one place Mark's voice couldn't follow me, the little white house at the end of Willow Street. Evelyn Hart had lived there for as long as I could remember. She was one of my father's closest friends, the kind of woman who remembered everything and forgot nothing. She had served nearly 20 years as a civilian investigator before retiring, and she carried herself like someone who had learned how to listen to lies without ever letting them stick. When I pulled up, her porch light was on. It always was. I sat in the car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, letting the engine hum fill the silence. I didn't even have to knock. Evelyn opened the door before I reached the steps, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her silver hair pulled back in a low braid. Clara, she said softly, not like a question. She had that way of speaking like she already knew something was wrong. She always did. I stepped inside and the warmth hit me. Her house smelled like cinnamon and cedarwood, the way my father's study used to smell before Mark stripped it bare. She handed me a towel for my hair, then poured me a cup of hot tea without asking. We sat at her kitchen table, the old wooden one with scratch marks from years of use. She didn't rush me. She never did. I set the letter down between us. She picked it up and read it carefully, her brow furrowing just slightly. Your father always wanted you to have that house, she said. He told me the day he signed the will. My throat tightened. Mark thinks he's entitled to it. He's already started clearing things out like it belongs to him, and now he's trying to get me to sign it over. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her hands folded around the mug. Her eyes sharpened the way they used to when she was working a case. Of course he is, she said. Men like Mark never stop at taking space. They take the walls around it too. I let out a shaky breath. He's careful. He never raises his voice. He does everything slow. And my mother, she just stands there. That's how people like him keep control, she said quietly. Not by shouting, by making everyone else feel small enough to stop fighting. She pushed the letter back toward me. You're not small, Clara. I didn't answer. My hands were shaking not from fear exactly, but from the weight of knowing she was right. Mark had spent years shrinking me without ever touching me. Evelyn stood and disappeared into the hallway for a moment. When she returned, she was holding a small black box. She set it down gently on the table. Inside was a neat set of equipment, a compact speaker with a hidden lens, a small microphone disguised as an outlet, and a simple black key fob with a single red button. This is legal, she said. You own that house. You have the right to protect yourself and your property. Virginia is a one-party consent state. That means if you're part of the conversation, you can record it. You don't need their permission. I stared at the devices. They looked small, almost unimpressive, but there was something powerful about them. I don't want to just fight him, I said quietly. I want to end this. Evelyn smiled faintly. Then you need the truth. His truth. Not yours. Not your mother's. His. She tapped the black speaker with her finger. Men like Mark always say more when they think they've already won. You make him comfortable, Clara. You let him show who he really is. And when he does, you'll have it on tape. The way she said it sent a chill through me, but it wasn't fear. It was clarity. She was right. He didn't scream or threaten in ways the world could see. But he spoke, and the words he used were just as sharp as knives. I nodded slowly. I can do that. She poured me more tea. And when the time comes, you're not going to fight him alone. I frowned. What do you mean? She picked up her phone and made a call right there at the table. A calm, steady voice answered on the other end. David, she said. It's Evelyn. I need a favor. I had heard the name before. David Reese, my father's old attorney, a man with the patience of a saint and the spine of steel. Evelyn explained everything while I sat there listening to her measured words. She didn't have to convince him. By the time she hung up, he had already agreed to help. David is going to prepare everything she said. If you ever need to escalate this legally, he'll make sure the evidence is protected. But we can't build a case on fear, Clara. We build it on what we can prove. You think it will come to that? She looked at me over the rim of her mug. With a man like Mark, yes. I stared down at the devices in front of me. A speaker, a microphone, a hidden fob. They didn't look like weapons, but in that moment they felt more powerful than anything I'd held in a long time. He doesn't see me as a threat, I said. He thinks I'll fold like my mother did. Evelyn's expression softened. Then, let him keep thinking that. People who underestimate you are the easiest to catch telling the truth. Her words settled into me like anchors. For the first time in months, the fear in my chest shifted into something colder, sharper, resolve. Evelyn walked me out to the porch when I left. The rain had lightened to a mist hanging in the air like a veil. She placed her hand on my shoulder. Your father trusted me to look out for you, she said softly. I promised him I would. So I'm going to tell you something he used to say to me when things got messy. I turned to her. What evil men are loud when they think no one's listening, she said. You're going to let him be loud, Clara, and you're going to make sure the world hears it. The porch light cast a warm glow across her face, and for a moment it felt like my father was there too. I held the black box tight against my chest as I walked back to my car. The windshield was fogged when I climbed in the night, pressing close around me. I opened the box again, running my fingers over the cold metal. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was planning. I wasn't just waiting for Mark to make his next move. I was ready for mine. When I started the engine, the wipers brushed away the mist, clearing the glass. The road home was dark and narrow, but it was straight. And this time, I wasn't driving back into fear. I was driving into a trap. Mine. I installed the speaker first. It looked so small against the corner wall of the living room. Just another piece of tech blending into the house Mark thought was already his. I placed it carefully angled toward the armchair he liked to claim, the one where he sat every night with his glass of wine like a king who had conquered something. The microphone was easier. I disguised it as an outlet near the baseboard by the hallway where his voice always carried late at night. The red light blinked once, then went still. From the outside, nothing looked different, but everything was. That house had been a cage for so long, but now it had eyes. It had ears. And they were mine. The first night, I didn't expect anything. I sat upstairs in my old room, the walls still holding faint outlines of posters I had ripped down when I left for college, and stared at my phone screen as the audio app ran silently in the background. Downstairs, I heard his boots, the scrape of the chair legs against the floor, the steady clink of glass on wood. It was almost comforting in its familiarity, but it carried the weight of a threat. Mark's routine was as precise as clockwork. He came home from work, washed his hands, poured his wine, and sat down to declare little truths to no one in particular. He liked to talk when he thought no one was listening, and that was exactly what I needed. I heard him humming softly that night. He didn't say much, but his voice carried that ownership I had grown to hate. It wasn't enough to build anything on, not yet, but it was a start. I kept recording, every night, every word. I learned his rhythm the way a hunter learns the steps of its prey. He had a habit of talking to the house as if it belonged to him. He would tell Diane what he planned to do with the place, which walls he wanted to tear down, what furniture had to go, what he'd sell, what he'd claim. Sometimes he'd lower his voice like the house itself might tell on him. The irony made me want to laugh. He didn't know it already was. The first usable recording came 3 nights later. Diane had made pasta. She was stirring sauce in the kitchen when Mark walked in, his voice a smooth mix of irritation and triumph. "She'll sign," he said. "She's too soft not to." Diane didn't answer. I heard the metallic scrape of a spoon against the pot. She always folds. She's like her father that way. Too trusting. The sound of a cork popping followed. Wine pouring. Once it's signed, we'll finally be done with her. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening, my pulse hammering in my throat. I wanted to storm downstairs to throw the truth in his face right then. But Evelyn's voice echoed in my head. Let him be loud. So I stayed still. And I let him talk. "She doesn't even understand what she's sitting on," he said, his voice lower now. "That land alone is worth a fortune. She's a fool, and fools always lose." Diane whispered something I couldn't make out, soft and unsure. He laughed. "She'll break. She always breaks." I pressed save on the recording with a steady hand. One file. A seed. But seeds grow. Over the next week, the house turned into a stage he didn't know he was performing on. Some nights he got bolder, probably because he thought he was winning. He started talking about how he would remodel everything. He bragged about what he would do with the insurance money once he refinanced the house. He talked about lawyers he had already spoken to, how he could make me look unstable if I fought him. "She'll lose everything," he said on a Thursday night, his voice thick with wine. "And when she does, she'll leave. She always leaves." I learned to breathe quietly so my own anger wouldn't drown out the recording. I didn't need to yell. I just needed the truth. Mark loved to narrate his victories before they happened. That was his flaw. The more comfortable he became, the more he showed me exactly who he was. Diane kept hovering like a shadow. She rarely pushed back. Most of the time, her silence was the softest kind of betrayal. One night, she whispered, "She's your stepdaughter," and he barked a short laugh. "That house is mine," he said. "She just hasn't realized it yet." I saved every word. I labeled every file. Evelyn taught me to keep backups on a separate cloud account Mark could never trace. David checked the timestamps, the legality, everything. If Mark so much as breathed a threat, we'd have it. I became invisible in my own house, and that was my advantage. I learned when he'd be alone, when he'd be with Diane, when his voice slipped into that lazy arrogance that came from believing he had already won. The recordings grew longer, dirtier, more careless. "She's not strong enough to fight me," he said one night. "She never was. Diane barely is. This house needs someone who knows how to take control. Someone like me." Diane said nothing. The silence was almost louder than his voice. That was the night I realized she was never going to save me. She had already chosen her side. Another night I caught something I hadn't expected. He was on the phone with someone. "Yeah," he said, "it's just a matter of time. Once it's signed over, I can move everything through the trust. She won't even know until it's too late. No, she won't fight. She's too much like her father. Soft, predictable." My hands curled into fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. My father had been many things. Weak wasn't one of them, but Mark had spent years rewriting the narrative of my family, and now he was performing it out loud. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't even move. I let the tape run. When he hung up, he hummed again. Always the same songless hum, like a man savoring a meal he hadn't finished yet. The house felt colder after that, but the fear that had lived in my ribs for years was changing. It wasn't paralyzing anymore. It was sharpening. By the 10th night, I had more than enough to prove intent. Evelyn came by to help me organize the files. We sat at the same kitchen table my father had built with his own hands, and she listened to the recordings one by one. She didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. When the last file ended, she met my eyes and said, "He's hanging himself with his own rope." David called that same evening. His voice was calm, but certain. "You have everything we need," he said. "If he crosses the line, we won't need to prove what kind of man he is. He's already proven it for us." I turned off the lights upstairs that night and stood at the top of the staircase listening to him below. He poured his wine. He hummed. He whispered things to Diane he thought no one would ever hear. He believed I was folding. He believed he had already won. But the house was no longer his stage. It was my witness. And it remembered everything. It remembered the weight of his voice, the shape of his greed, the quiet way my mother let it happen. He didn't know that every breath he took in that living room was being kept safe in places he could never touch. I pressed my palm against the wall by the staircase, feeling the cool plaster under my hand. For years, this house had belonged to my father. Then it was claimed by a man who had done nothing to earn it. But now, piece by piece, I was taking it back. Not by force, by truth. The kind that doesn't whisper, the kind that doesn't lie, the kind that plays back word for word in front of a judge. And Mark Halpern was giving me every single line of his confession without even knowing it. The tape wasn't just rolling anymore. It was building a case. Dinner in that house had always felt like a performance, but in those final weeks it became a silent war. The table was set the same way every night. Diane's white plates, Mark's favorite bottle of wine, the dim yellow light above the table that made the shadows stretch long across the walls. The house smelled like rosemary chicken that night, but underneath the warmth of the food, there was a thickness in the air that could not be ignored. It felt like the air itself knew something was breaking. Mark sat at the head of the table like always. He didn't even have to claim the seat anymore. He leaned back, swirling his wine with that quiet arrogance I had memorized. Diane moved around him like someone who had been trained to keep peace even when peace didn't exist. She served his plate first. She always did. He looked up at me with that smile that had no warmth in it. "You're quiet tonight," he said, taking a slow sip. I met his eyes but didn't answer. Silence was my sharpest weapon now. He hated silence because he couldn't control it. When I didn't respond, he let out a low hum. "Big day tomorrow," he said. "We've got a lot to discuss about the house." I stabbed my fork into the chicken. "We don't," I said. His smile twitched, but only slightly. He loved to pretend he was patient. "Clara," he said, drawing my name out like a teacher correcting a child. "We all have to make sacrifices. That house is too much for one person to handle. You'll understand eventually." I didn't look away. "No, Mark. I understand perfectly." Diane cleared her throat softly, placing her napkin on her lap, like she thought that would keep the evening civilized. But civility had been gone from this house for a long time. Mark set his wine glass down with a soft clink. He folded his hands and leaned forward. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "You think you're standing your ground, but all you're doing is making it uglier." "It's already ugly," I said. "You made sure of that." His eyes narrowed for just a second, the smallest fracture in the mask he wore every day. I could tell he hated that I was calm. I had stopped flinching. I had stopped giving him what he wanted. The tape was already stacked and organized, but he didn't know that. To him, I was still the soft girl who would fold, and that made him careless. He took another sip of wine and smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think you can hold on to something you don't even deserve," he said. "This house needs someone who can take care of it. Someone with a plan. Your father didn't leave it to you because he thought you could handle it. He did it because he felt guilty. He knew you couldn't manage it alone." The words slid into the air like poison, but they didn't burn the way they used to. They landed flat. I had already heard worse from his recordings. Diane set her fork down and whispered, "Mark." But he waved her off. "No," he said. "She needs to hear this. She's living in a fantasy. She thinks she can just hold on to something she isn't strong enough to keep." I kept my voice low steady. "I'm not signing anything over." He stared at me for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. He thought silence would make me doubt myself, but it didn't. I had spent nights sitting alone in that house, listening to his voice on recordings, learning his rhythms. I knew exactly how he tried to break people down. His control was built on fear, and I wasn't afraid anymore. Diane picked at the edge of her napkin like it was a lifeline. Mark broke the silence first. "You're just like your father," he said. "Stubborn, naive. You think principles keep the lights on." He tilted his head, studying me the way a hunter studies a wounded animal. "He was weak, Clara, and so are you." Once those words would have cut through me like glass. But now I almost wanted to laugh. My father had been many things, but weak was not one of them. Weak men didn't build legacies. Weak men didn't inspire loyalty that lasted decades. Weak men didn't have friends like Evelyn. He had always hated my father. I could hear it in the way he said his name, because he could never be him. He wasn't weak, I said. He was everything you'll never be. Something flashed in his eyes, quick and dangerous. But then it was gone. He forced another smile and picked up his wine. I guess it doesn't matter now, he said. Because soon, none of this will be yours anymore. He raised the glass like a toast to himself. Diane's hand trembled as she reached for the salt shaker, as if pretending to be busy would make the conversation disappear. She looked at me for a brief second, a flicker of something in her eyes that might have been guilt, but it passed like a cloud. She had chosen this silence long ago. Mark leaned back again, confidence returning like an old friend. You're going to regret this, Clara, he said, when you're out there with nothing. When this house finally belongs to someone who deserves it. You'll regret not listening. I didn't answer. Instead, I let the silence settle again, heavy and deliberate. His voice filled spaces when he was uncomfortable, and the more he talked, the more he gave himself away. I could feel the red light from the speaker in the corner behind me blinking softly. It was there every night now, and every night he told on himself a little more. He didn't see it. He never saw anything outside of his own ego. This house, he said slowly, was wasted on your father. It was wasted on your mother, and it will not be wasted on you. Diane's eyes flicked toward him, and I caught the faintest flicker of fear there. She was realizing what he really thought of everyone, even her. Mark had stopped pretending a long time ago. He thought he had already won. He thought these dinners were victory laps. He didn't know they were evidence. He finished his plate, wiped his hands with the cloth napkin like nothing in the world could touch him, and stood up. I'll see you in the morning, he said. Think about what you're doing. I didn't reply. He left the dining room with the same heavy, entitled steps he always had, his boots echoing down the hallway. Diane sat still for a moment, staring at her hands. She looked older than she had just a year ago. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stayed in her silence because it was safer than standing against him. I rose from the table slowly. The smell of dinner clung to the air, but underneath it I could feel something else. The tide was shifting. His words didn't break me anymore. They were proof. They were threads in a noose he had made for himself. The house was quiet again. The blinking red light in the corner kept its silent watch, catching every breath, every sneer, every word. And as I stood there in the dim light, I realized Mark wasn't the storm anymore. He was the evidence, and the storm was coming for him. It was late when it happened, the kind of late where the house feels hollow like it's holding its breath. The rain had stopped hours earlier, but the night was heavy with the smell of damp earth and wood. I sat in my room with the light off, staring at the faint glow of the hallway leaking through the crack under my door. The house was too quiet, and quiet in this house never meant peace. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, slow, unhurried. Mark never rushed when he thought he was in control. The door creaked open without a knock, because why would he knock in a house he believed belonged to him? I turned my head toward the sound, and there he was standing in the doorway in a plain white t-shirt and dark jeans, holding the small wooden box that had lived on my dresser since I was 12. My father's box, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco. The one thing he had never managed to touch. Until now. You're still awake, he said. His voice carried the same calm, smug confidence it always did. The kind of calm that only comes when someone is convinced they've already won. I sat up slowly, my pulse pounding in my throat. Put it down, I said. He walked into the room like he hadn't heard me, like my words didn't matter here. He set the box on the floor, crouched down, and flipped it open with a casual flick of his hand. Inside were the last few things of my father's I'd managed to keep safe. A pocket watch, a faded photograph of us in the backyard, a folded map with his handwriting on the edges. Mark reached in and lifted the pocket watch between two fingers, holding it up like it was a worthless trinket he'd found in the trash. This is what you're holding on to, he said. This is why you're making everything so hard. Put it down. I said again, louder this time. He tilted his head, smiling that thin, practiced smile that never reached his eyes. You don't get it, Clara. These things don't mean anything. They're just pieces of the past. He dropped the watch back into the box and stepped on it. The sound was sharp, a crack that split through the quiet like a gunshot. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the crushed metal my father's watch flattened beneath his boot. I could see the edges bent inward, the face fractured, the chain twisted. He lifted his foot and looked down at what he'd done with a small laugh. There, he said. Now it's just junk, like everything else in this house. I stood up, the blood roaring in my ears. Why, I whispered. He didn't even pretend to think about it. Because this isn't your house. This isn't your life. This is mine now. All of it. He turned and kicked the box across the floor. The photograph slid out and fluttered toward the baseboard. He stepped on it too, grinding it under his heel like it was nothing. The map tore down the middle with a sound that made something deep in my chest twist. It wasn't just paper. It was the last pieces of him. Mark bent down, picked up the broken watch, and held it up again, letting the fractured glass catch the hallway light. Do you know what your problem is? He asked. You think this house is about love, about memory. It's not. It's about ownership, and I own this place. Not you, not your father. Me! I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear that watch out of his hand and push him out of the house and lock every door. But I didn't move. I remembered Evelyn's words. Let him talk. Let him be loud. And so I stood there shaking while he told the world exactly who he was. You're weak, he said, stepping closer. Your father was weak too. He left a house but no power. That's what men like him do. They build pretty little memories and think it means something. But people like me, we take what we want. The red light on the speaker in the hallway blinked faintly, catching every word, every sneer. His voice filled the room like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Diane appeared behind him, then standing at the end of the hallway in her robe. Her hands were pressed together, her eyes wide. She didn't say a word. She just watched. Just like always. Mark, she whispered. He didn't even turn to look at her. Go back to bed, he said. His tone was soft, but it wasn't a request. She stepped back, fading into the shadows like a woman who'd forgotten how to fight for anything. My stomach turned. She had watched him erase my father from this house piece by piece. Now she was watching him erase the last of what was left. I knelt down slowly, my hands trembling, and reached for the torn photograph. He laughed an ugly sound that filled the room. You really think picking up scraps is going to save you, he said. I didn't answer. My hands brushed against the ripped paper. His boots moved closer, the leather creaking against the floor. He leaned down beside me. You should stop fighting Clara. It's pathetic. I turned my head toward him, and for the first time I let him see it. The rage. Not the quiet kind I had carried for months, but the cold, clear fury that had been building underneath it all. I'm not the one who's pathetic, I said. His smile flickered then, just for a second like a match sputtering before it goes out, but he recovered fast. We'll see, he said. He stepped back, looked around the room one last time, and then walked out like a man inspecting his property. Diane lingered in the hallway for a few seconds longer, her face pale, her mouth opening like she might say something. She didn't. She turned and followed him. The moment their footsteps faded, I let myself breathe again. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the broken pieces of what used to be my father's life. The photograph was smudged, the map was torn in two, the watch was shattered, but the house had heard everything. The speaker had caught every single word that had left his mouth. Ownership. Weak. Mine. The words he thought would stay locked inside these walls were already stored somewhere he couldn't touch. I held the torn photograph in my hand and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't grief this time. It was steel. It was clarity. He thought he had finally broken me by crushing what little I had left. He didn't understand that the pieces he broke were no longer my armor. They were my ammunition. I gathered every scrap, every shard, every piece he tried to destroy and placed them back inside the box. It wasn't about fixing them. It was about remembering exactly what he'd done. This night would not fade away. It would live in evidence. It would live in the blinking red light. The house was no longer his battlefield. It was my witness. I placed the box back on the dresser, the broken watch still inside, and as I stared at it, I made myself a promise so quiet that only the walls could hear it. I would not run. I would not fold. He wanted ownership. I would give him consequence. In the darkness of that room surrounded by everything he tried to erase, the war stopped being cold. The fuse had been lit. It happened on a night so still it felt like the house itself was waiting for something. The storm that had passed earlier left behind a damp chill that hung in the air like breath against glass. The windows were fogged, and every sound echoed a little too loudly in the quiet. I was in the living room barefoot, wearing an old sweater that still faintly smelled of my father's cologne. I had stayed downstairs later than usual, not because I felt safe here, but because I refused to hide anymore. The box with my father's broken watch was upstairs, but the memory of Mark's boot crushing it lived right behind my ribs. I could still hear the sharp crack, still see the way his mouth curved into that smile. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I was done shrinking. I was done letting him believe this house was his. I heard the front door open slowly, the hinges creaking just enough to send a cold thread down my spine. Mark's boots thudded on the floor, heavy and slow, each step a declaration of ownership. Diane's footsteps followed softer, hesitant. I didn't turn around. I just stared at the old clock on the wall, the same clock my father wound every Sunday, and waited. His voice came from behind me, low and calm, like always. "You're still up." "Yes," I said. My voice sounded sharper than I expected, like it had been carved into shape by every cruel word he'd ever said. He set his keys on the table with a deliberate clink. "We need to talk." "No," I said without moving. "You need to listen." That made him laugh. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of laugh a man gives when he's sure he's already won. "You think you have a choice in how this ends, Clara," he said. I turned then slowly to face him. He was standing just inside the doorway, his shoulders relaxed, his wine bottle dangling loosely from one hand. Diane hovered a few feet behind him, her hands pressed together, eyes flicking between us like someone watching a fire they couldn't put out. I met his gaze without flinching. "I know I have a choice," I said. His smile thinned. "Then choose wisely," he said. He stepped closer, unscrewing the cap on the bottle as he moved. "This house isn't yours. It never was. It's mine now. You just haven't accepted it yet." My heart was beating hard, but not the way it used to when he cornered me with his voice. It wasn't fear anymore. It was focus. I didn't move as he walked into the living room and dropped into my father's chair like he belonged there. He poured the wine into a glass he'd left on the side table earlier, leaned back, and took a long drink. Diane whispered something behind him too soft for me to catch, and he waved her off without looking. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "You sign the papers and we don't have to keep doing this dance. You get some money. I get the house. Everyone wins." I took a step closer. "Except my father," I said. His eyes flashed just for a second. "Your father's dead," he said flatly. "This house belongs to the living now." He thought that would hurt me, and once it would have. But not anymore. He was just confirming what he had always been. A man who believed nothing mattered except what he could hold in his hands. I moved another step forward, my bare feet silent on the wood. "He's not here," I said quietly. "But I am, and I'm not signing anything." His smile faltered. Not much, but enough for me to see the crack beneath it. "Clara," he said in that soft, warning tone. "Don't be stupid." I laughed then. It surprised even me. It wasn't a hysterical laugh or a scared one. It was a sharp, cold sound that filled the room like a blade scraping against stone. Diane stiffened at the sound of it. Mark leaned forward in the chair, wineglass in hand, studying me the way someone studies a puzzle they can't quite solve. "What's funny?" he asked. "You," I said. "You think you're untouchable. You think no one sees what you really are." "I don't need to be untouchable," he said. "I just need to win." He set the glass down, leaned back again, and exhaled through his nose. "And I always do." He stood up then, closing the space between us in 3 easy steps. He wasn't drunk. He never let himself get that far. He liked being in control too much. He stopped just in front of me, close enough for me to smell the wine on his breath. He leaned down, his voice dropping even lower. "You can either hand this house over," he said, "or I'll take it from you. Either way, it's mine." I could feel Diane watching from the hallway. I could feel the weight of years pressing against my back, the years he had spent slowly hollowing this house out of everything it used to be. "You can't take what was never yours," I whispered. Something in his face shifted. His jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, he looked almost startled that I had said it. Then the mask dropped back into place. He grabbed my arm. It wasn't a hard grip at first. It was the kind of grip a man uses when he wants to remind you who's stronger. But I didn't move. He squeezed tighter. "You're not going to win this," he said through his teeth. I stared right into his eyes. I already did. The red light on the speaker hidden near the bookcase blinked once. His voice was on record. His threat was on record. And he didn't even notice. He jerked me forward suddenly, maybe expecting me to stumble. My heel caught on the edge of the rug and my shoulder slammed into the oak cabinet. Pain shot down my spine like fire. I heard Diane gasp, but she didn't move. He leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "You don't know when to shut up," he hissed. My hand slipped against the cabinet, searching for balance, and for a split second I thought I might stay upright, but then he shoved me. It wasn't a push meant to bruise. It was a shove meant to end the conversation. My head hit the cabinet with a dull, sick sound. The world tilted sideways. I didn't fall so much as fold my knees, buckling my body, crashing to the floor. The cold wood met my skin, and for a second I couldn't tell where the pain ended and the house began. I heard Diane's voice, high and strained. "Mark!" He cut her off with a single word. "Stay." His boots moved across the floor toward the chair. I forced my eyes open. My vision blurred at the edges, but I could still make out his figure sitting down again, calm as if nothing had happened. He poured another glass of wine, raised it to his lips, and took a long, slow drink. A single drop of my blood slid down his finger and into the dark red wine. He didn't even look at it. He just drank. "From now on, Clara," he said softly, "it's all mine." The words slid through the air like a knife, quiet and sure. Diane stood frozen in the hallway, hands clutched at her chest. She didn't move. She didn't call 911. She didn't even kneel down beside me. She just trembled and looked away. The room smelled like wine and iron. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second carving itself into my memory. My breath came in shallow pulls, the edges of the room slipping further away. But through the haze, one thing stayed sharp, the tiny red light blinking in the corner. The tape was still rolling. His threats, his voice, his hands, all of it. My fingers twitched against the floorboards. I couldn't speak, but I didn't need to. I had already done the one thing he never expected me to do. I made the house remember. His wine glass clinked softly against the armrest. He leaned back with the ease of a man convinced nothing could touch him. My blood was drying on the wood. His wine was half gone. The house was silent except for the sound of the rain starting again outside. My eyes flicked toward Diane. For a moment, I thought she might come closer, but then she stepped back. Cowardice is quiet. It wears no expression. My body felt heavy, but my mind was clear. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. I let the darkness pull me under, not because I was giving up, but because I knew every second of this moment was being stored somewhere he couldn't control. The tape didn't care how powerful he thought he was. The tape didn't lie. He thought this was the night he took everything. He had no idea it was the night he gave me everything I needed to destroy him. The day of the trap began the way most quiet wars end. Not with shouting, not with a gunshot, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that makes the air feel like it's holding its breath. Outside, the late autumn sky hung low and gray over Richmond, and the trees along Willow Street had shed most of their leaves, their branches skeletal against the pale light. I woke up in Evelyn's spare bedroom, not in the house on Willow Lane. The bruises on my temple had faded into a dull ache. but the memory of that night lived in the hollow behind my ribs. Mark had no idea that while he sipped his wine with my blood on his hands, the house itself had turned into a witness. I had watched the video again the night before, not because I needed proof for myself, but because I wanted to memorize the sound of his voice, the low, soft arrogance of a man who believed he could not be touched. David Reese sat across from me at Evelyn's kitchen table with a cup of coffee in one hand and a file in the other. He was dressed in his usual gray suit tie, perfectly knotted expression, calm but unyielding. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. His voice was steady, the same tone he used when talking to people who were standing on the edge of something irreversible. "Yes," I said. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't even anger. It was clarity. Evelyn set a plate of toast in front of me, but neither of us touched it. Her scrubs were wrinkled from the night shift, her hair pulled back, her eyes tired but fierce. She didn't need to say anything. She had already said it weeks ago, let him underestimate you. Let him walk straight into the fire he built. David tapped the folder lightly. "We've got the audio. We've got the video. We've got his words, his threats, the physical assault, and Diane standing by doing nothing. The police have a warrant ready to execute. As soon as he's in that room, they'll move. But I need you steady, Clara. He'll try to get in your head. He'll try to rattle you." I nodded. "He can't rattle me anymore." Evelyn's hand found mine across the table, a quiet anchor in the storm. "He's going to think he's already won," she said. "Good," I replied. "Let him." 2 hours later, I walked into David's downtown law office, my boots clicking against the polished wood floors. The building smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. It was quiet, the kind of quiet I had once feared, but now owned. In the main conference room, the long wooden table gleamed under soft lighting. A large monitor was mounted on the wall cables tucked out of sight. David had tested it 3 times already, making sure everything played perfectly. Every word, every drop of wine, every second of silence. Evelyn stood by the door in plain clothes, not part of the legal team, just there. My ally. She leaned against the wall arms crossed a silent sentry. David straightened his tie. "They'll be here any minute," he said. Outside, a light drizzle began to fall soft against the glass. Richmond's streets blurred with the gray of the sky. And then I heard it, the sound of expensive shoes on tile. Mark Halpern had always walked like the world owed him space. He entered the room first wearing a charcoal coat and that same smile that once made my stomach twist. Diane followed a step behind him, wrapped in a cream coat, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Her lipstick was carefully applied, her hair curled. It was a costume the same one she had worn for years. She was pretending everything was fine. She always did. Mark's eyes flicked over the room, landing on me, then David, then Evelyn. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He just smirked. "Clara," he said. "Good to see you've decided to be reasonable." David gestured to the seats across the table. "Please sit down." They sat. Mark poured himself water from the glass pitcher, like this was any other meeting, like he was the one in control. Diane smoothed her skirt and gave me a brittle smile, the kind mothers give when they're trying to erase the blood under the rug. "We're glad we're doing this civilly," she said. I didn't answer. David opened a file in front of him, his movements precise. "Before we begin, I want to make sure we're all clear on why we're here," he said. "This is a meeting to discuss the disputed property on Willow Lane, formerly owned by Mr. Reynolds. My client, Clara Reynolds, is the sole legal heir of that property." Mark leaned back, feigning a sigh. "Yes, yes. We all know that," he said. "And that's why we're here, to make this easy for her. We have the paperwork ready. She signs. She walks away with a nice payout. And we can all move on with our lives." David's expression didn't change. "Right," he said evenly. "But there are a few complications that have to be addressed before we talk about signatures." Mark's smile tightened, but he waved a hand. "Fine, let's hear it." David pressed a button on the small remote in his hand. The monitor behind him flickered to life. At first it was just audio, his voice, low, confident, unmistakable. "This house isn't yours. It never was. It's mine now." His own words filled the room. Mark froze. Diane's fingers tightened around her purse. David pressed another button and the screen shifted to video. The living room. My body on the floor. his wine glass in his hand, his voice saying from now on, "It's all mine." He didn't even blink in the footage. He looked like a man savoring victory, the blood on the floor, the red wine, the blinking red light. Diane gasped softly, a sound that barely carried. Mark's jaw clenched so tightly I thought I could hear his teeth grind. "What the hell is this?" he said finally, his voice hard. "Evidence," David said calmly, "of assault, coercion, threats, and witness negligence. And this," he nodded toward the monitor, "is already in the hands of the Richmond Police Department. The moment this meeting started, the officers were notified. They're just waiting for me to give the word." "You can't," Mark started, but David cut him off. "I can, and I have." He let the footage keep playing. Every cruel word, every threat, every moment of silence. Diane covered her mouth with one hand. Mark turned his glare on me. It wasn't the smirk anymore. It was something raw and sharp. "You little," David's voice sliced through his like steel. "I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you." Mark leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "You think this is going to scare me?" he said. "You think this is enough to—" A knock interrupted him. The door opened and two uniformed officers stepped into the room. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The air shifted as soon as they entered. Mark Halpern, the taller officer, said, "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of aggravated assault, coercion, and attempted fraud." Mark's face drained of color. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane," he said. "She's lying. This is all a lie." But the tape didn't lie. The room was filled with his own voice wrapping around him like a noose. Diane whispered his name, but she didn't stand. The officers stepped forward. Mark backed away toward the wall, his eyes flicking between me, David, and the officers, trying to find a crack, a weakness. But there wasn't one left. Mark Halpern, the officer, repeated, "Please place your hands behind your back." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The officers didn't wait for him to agree. They turned him around, cuffed his wrists, and read him his rights with the steady rhythm of people who had done this 1,000 times before. His hands, the same hands that had crushed my father's watch, were now locked in cold steel. Diane pressed a trembling hand against her chest, whispering, "Mark, please." He looked at her then, and for the first time in my life I saw fear on his face. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. He turned it on me like it was supposed to save him. "Clara," he said, "you can fix this. You can tell them it was a mistake. We're family." I stared at him, and the memory of him drinking wine while I bled burned in the back of my mind. "No," I said softly, "we're not." Diane let out a small, broken sound. One of the officers guided Mark toward the door. The other paused to nod at David. The door closed behind them with a quiet click. It didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a lock sliding into place. Diane stayed seated, hands limp in her lap. "Clara," she whispered. "I didn't mean for—" "Yes," I said. "You did. You meant to look away." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. No rage, no pity. Just distance. David closed the file in front of him with a quiet snap. "The property is yours," he said. "The title will be cleared by the end of the week. The DA's office already has everything they need for the case." I nodded. Evelyn pushed off the wall, walking toward me. Her hand brushed my shoulder, steady and warm. "You did it," she said softly. "No," I said. "He did. He just didn't know it." Diane rose slowly, her legs shaking. "He's your stepfather," she said, her voice trembling. "He's still family." "No," I said again, this time with finality. "Family protects you. He tried to destroy me, and you let him." She flinched like I'd hit her, but I didn't feel guilty. I walked past her toward the door. The hallway outside smelled like rain and paper. The world beyond that door wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. Evelyn followed me out, and David stayed behind to handle the paperwork. The drizzle had turned into steady rain by the time we reached the street. Evelyn opened an umbrella, but I tilted my face up into the cold water anyway. It felt clean. It felt real. Across the street, the police car's lights flashed silently, casting red and blue shadows on the wet pavement. Mark sat in the back seat, his head down. For a man who had spent so many years pretending to own everything, he looked small behind the glass. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked. I thought about the house, the nights, the wine, the tape. I thought about the girl who had once whispered to herself in the dark, convinced no one would believe her. And then I thought about this moment, about the weight lifting off my chest. "I'm free," I said. She squeezed my shoulder and didn't say anything else. We stood in the rain and watched the car pull away. The world didn't erupt into applause. No music swelled. It was just rain and streetlights and the sound of tires rolling over wet asphalt. But it was enough. It was everything. Diane stepped out of the building behind us, but she didn't call my name. She just stood there looking lost. I didn't turn back. Evelyn and I walked toward the parking lot, the night folding softly around us. Inside that conference room, the ghost of Mark's arrogance still hung in the air. But out here, it was gone. He wasn't untouchable. He never had been. He just needed someone to press record. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood paper and rain. Richmond was still gray that morning, the kind of gray that sinks into everything and makes the air feel heavy. It had been 3 weeks since Mark's arrest. 3 weeks since the tape that he never knew existed shattered the power he thought he had. 3 weeks since I stopped living in fear inside the house that used to belong to my father and started reclaiming it piece by piece. I walked up the courthouse steps with Evelyn on one side and David Reese on the other. My boots made soft, measured sounds on the stone. The hearing was short procedural, even because there was nothing left for Mark's lawyer to twist. The evidence was clean. The footage didn't just show what happened that night, it showed everything. His voice, his control, his absolute certainty that I couldn't touch him. The judge listened to the audio in silence, his face unreadable, but his eyes sharpened at the sound of Mark's words. The words he said while sipping wine, the words he thought were buried in the walls. Diane sat a few rows behind him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She hadn't spoken to me since the arrest. She had hired her own lawyer, trying to distance herself from the damage, but the truth sat on that tape too. She had been there. She had chosen silence. When the judge read the verdict, his voice didn't need to rise. Mark Halpern is found guilty of aggravated assault, coercion, and attempted fraud. The words landed like stones on water rippling out through the courtroom. Mark didn't look at me at first. He stared straight ahead, his jaw locked tight. But when they cuffed him again and stood him up, he turned. There was no arrogance left in his eyes, only the dull rage of a man who couldn't believe the world wasn't built to serve him. I held his gaze for a long moment, not out of triumph, but out of something quieter, something heavier. He had tried to erase me from my own house, from my father's memory, from the life I built. And he failed. Diane's eyes were wet. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The bailiff led him away. The sound of the cell door closing later that day would become one of those sounds that lived in my memory like the ticking of the clock in the old living room. When we stepped outside, the rain was just beginning to lift. The clouds were still thick, but the edges were brightening. I breathed in the cold air like someone who had been holding their breath too long. Evelyn wrapped an arm around my shoulders as we walked down the steps. "It's done," she said. "No," I said quietly. "It's beginning." A week later, I walked back through the front door of the house on Willow Lane. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like trespassing. The floors creaked under my boots. The walls smelled faintly of cedar and rain, and the light coming through the front windows hit the living room floor like it used to when my father sat in his chair on Sunday mornings reading the paper. The chair was gone. The blood was gone. But the house remembered. And so did I. I had spent days cleaning, not scrubbing away the past, but claiming it. I took the photographs that Mark had torn down from the walls and reframed them. I repaired the shelf he had chipped when he threw my father's things away. The broken pocket watch was still in its box upstairs, not fixed but kept exactly as it was, a scar I refused to hide. Scars tell stories better than perfection ever could. The locks had been changed. His name was stripped from every piece of paper. Diane had left town after the trial, moving in with a cousin somewhere near Norfolk. She sent me a letter she didn't have the courage to hand me in person. It said she was sorry. It said she didn't know what to do. It said she hoped someday I would forgive her. I didn't write back. Some silences are too old to break. The neighborhood was quieter without him. I walked through the rooms slowly that first night barefoot, letting my hands brush against the doorframes and windowsills like I was learning the house again. The living room where he said it's all mine. The hallway where Diane stood and did nothing. The spot where the tape blinked red. It didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt like the moment after a storm when the world is still damp but the air is clear. David came by 2 days later with the final paperwork. He laid the envelope on the table where Mark used to sit. "It's officially yours," he said. His smile was small but real. No more loopholes, no more threats. I opened the envelope and ran my fingers over the deed with my name on it. Not because the paper mattered, but because the power behind it did. Mark had spent years trying to convince me I didn't belong here. Now, legally and irrevocably, I did. Evelyn joined us that night, bringing over 2 cups of coffee and a quiet laugh. We sat on the front porch as the sky turned the soft pink of early evening. The crickets hummed low in the distance. "You could sell it," she said gently. "Start fresh somewhere else." I shook my head. "I'm not running from this house. He already tried to take it once. It's mine, and I'm staying." She nodded like she'd known I'd say that all along. "Then make it yours," she said. "Not his. Not even your father's. Yours." I thought about that for a long time after she left. For years, I had thought of this house as a battleground, a place I had to defend against him. But now, it wasn't about defense anymore. It was about building something new. I started small, repainting the walls, planting the hydrangeas my father had always talked about but never got to plant, replacing the light bulb on the porch that Mark let burn out because he said it didn't matter. It did matter. Every small thing mattered now. On the first Sunday after the deed arrived, I made myself coffee and sat on the porch steps wrapped in a blanket, listening to the morning settle over the neighborhood. The wind rustled through the trees. A cardinal landed on the fence bright red against the dull winter grass. The world was quiet, not silent like the night he hurt me, but soft, alive. When the mail came that day, it wasn't threatening letters or legal documents. It was a simple envelope with my name on it. Inside was a small brochure from a local women's advocacy group. It was the same group Evelyn had volunteered with years ago. At the bottom was a handwritten note in her neat script. "You have something powerful. Use it." That night, I sat in the kitchen with the black speaker that had recorded everything. I thought about what it meant that a single red light had changed everything, that something so small had forced the truth into the light. Evelyn had called it evidence. I called it the moment I took my life back. A month later, I stood in the same courthouse where Mark had been sentenced, but this time it wasn't for me. It was for the first group meeting of what we decided to call Silent Proof, a small organization to help women in inheritance and coercion cases record, document, and fight back legally. We didn't build it with anger. We built it with proof. Real, quiet, undeniable proof. We were small at first, but word spread. People came with their stories, and for the first time, they didn't have to carry them alone. I told mine at the first meeting. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just told it the way it happened. The blood, the wine, the tape, the arrest, the house. When I finished, the room was silent in that way that isn't empty, the way that's full of something sharp and alive. And for the first time, I wasn't just a woman who survived. I was a woman who fought back. One evening, months later, I stood alone in the living room, the fading light catching on the framed photographs on the walls. My father's chair had been replaced with a new one, but the old clock still ticked on the wall. The same steady rhythm that had carried me through the worst night of my life. Outside, the hydrangeas I had planted were starting to bloom. I walked to the center of the room where I had once lain bleeding and closed my eyes. I could still see him sitting there with the wine glass in his hand, but now that image didn't have power over me. It was just a memory, a scar, proof. The house wasn't silent anymore. It was mine, and I intended to fill it with voices he could never silence again. On the anniversary of my father's passing, I placed the broken watch on the mantel. I didn't fix it. It didn't need to be fixed. It needed to be seen. It was the night he tried to erase me, and the night he gave me everything I needed to bring him down. Evelyn joined me on the porch that evening. We didn't talk about Mark. We didn't need to. The world had already moved on, and so had I. The rain came softly again, just like the night it all began, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was a quiet reminder. Storms end. Houses remember. And the tape never lies. 1 year later, the house on Willow Lane looked nothing like the place where everything had fallen apart. The hydrangeas bloomed in soft blues and purples along the fence, their colors spilling gently into the street like quiet victories. The porch light that Mark had ignored for years now glowed every evening, casting a warm halo across the steps. I still woke early most mornings just before the sun crested over the rooftops, wrapping my hands around a mug of coffee and listening to the world wake up. There was peace in routine, real peace, not the fragile kind I once pretended existed to keep the house from shaking. The court case was no longer a headline. Mark's name was now a case file buried somewhere in the Virginia Department of Corrections system. Diane hadn't returned to Richmond. The letters had stopped months ago. Her silence for once felt like freedom. The house didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like mine. I hadn't painted over the scratch on the oak cabinet where my head had hit. I hadn't replaced the floorboard where the wine had soaked in. I left them exactly as they were, because they weren't stains. They were proof that I had survived. They were proof that I had built something new on top of the wreckage. Evelyn still came by every Friday, always with coffee, and always with a question about the women at Silent Proof. The organization had grown faster than either of us imagined. It started with a handful of women in a cold courthouse room. Now it had an office downtown, a small legal team, volunteers, and a quiet force that made people listen. We didn't promise justice overnight. We taught people how to build it piece by piece, recording the words their abusers thought would disappear in the dark. We gave them what Evelyn gave me that night, a way to make the walls remember, a way to make the truth louder than fear. On the anniversary of the night Mark hurt me, I stood in that same living room. The evening light was warm, the kind that turns gold when it slips through old glass. The tape that had once been just my lifeline had become something else entirely. It had become a reminder that sometimes survival isn't quiet. Sometimes it's recorded. Sometimes it's played back in a courtroom where the truth cuts through lies like a blade through silk. Evelyn stood beside me, older but unshakable, the same way she'd been the night she placed the black speaker in my hands. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Not with fear," I said, "with clarity." She smiled softly. "That's different." It was. I thought about the sound of his voice, the glass, the blood, the stillness. I thought about how he believed no one was listening, and I thought about the tiny, blinking red light that said otherwise. After she left that evening, I sat at my kitchen table laptop open, answering emails from women across the country who had found us. Some were still scared. Some were ready to fight. All of them were tired of being silenced. I wrote back to every single one, not with platitudes, with steps, with resources, with strategies, with proof. The wind rustled through the trees outside, and for the first time in a long time, I felt rooted, not trapped. Rooted. I walked outside into the cool night air barefoot, the porch light humming softly behind me. The sky above Richmond was clear, the stars faint but steady. I sat on the steps holding the broken pocket watch in my hands. The glass was still cracked. The chain was still bent. I never fixed it because it didn't need fixing. It was the reminder of a night that could have ended everything, and instead became the night I took my life back. People asked me sometimes if I regretted not leaving the house after everything, but the truth was, leaving would have meant he took something from me even after he was gone. Staying was my choice, my victory. My father's house was my house now, and it was filled with something he could never touch my voice. At Silent Proof's first annual gathering, I told my story again. This time, I stood at a podium instead of on a witness stand. The faces in the audience were lit by soft lights. They weren't just listening to me, they were listening for themselves. A year ago, I said I thought no one would ever believe me. I thought silence was my only option, but silence was his weapon, not mine. So I pressed record. And the tape never lied. The room was silent when I finished. Not empty silence. The kind that holds breath, the kind that hums with shared understanding. Then the applause came, not loud or showy, but steady, strong. I walked off the stage and looked at the faces of women who were still in their battles. Some would win in months. Some would take years. But they weren't alone. I had been alone once, and I survived. They wouldn't have to. Later that night, I returned to Willow Lane. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet I had once feared and now cherished. I ran my fingers along the hallway wall where the tape had blinked red. Then I walked into the living room, turned off the lights, and sat down on the rug where I had bled a year ago. This time, I wasn't lying on the floor. I wasn't helpless. I was home. I whispered softly into the dark, not to Mark, not to the past, but to myself. The tape never lies. Outside, the hydrangeas swayed gently in the night breeze. Inside the house was steady, warm, alive. The story didn't end the night he was arrested. It didn't end in the courtroom. It ended here, with me. Still standing, still fighting, still free. If you've made it this far, take a breath with me. Not the kind of breath you take when everything is fine, but the one that comes when the storm finally settles and the walls are no longer listening to someone else's voice. Clara's story isn't just about a house, or even about a man who thought he could own what was never his. It's about the moment silence broke. It's about one red, blinking light in a quiet room that turned a victim into a witness, and a witness into a force that could not be ignored. I want you to think about this for a moment. What would you have done if it were you in that room? If it were your home, your memories, your father's chair, your name written on a piece of paper that someone else wanted to steal? Would you have pressed record? Would you have believed that your truth was enough to be heard? So many people carry their stories in the dark. So many keep them quiet because they've been told no one will believe them. But stories like Clara's remind us of something fierce and simple. Silence protects the guilty, not the innocent. And the tape never lies. If this story stirred something inside, you don't just walk away in silence. Talk to me in the comments. Tell me what part made your heart tighten. Tell me what you would have done in her place. Tell me if someone in your life needs to hear this. Your words matter here. Your story matters too. This isn't just another channel. It's a space where the voices that were buried too long can breathe again. And maybe, just maybe, your comment will be the light someone else needs to see. If you believe that truth deserves to be heard, hit like. If you stand with those who refuse to be erased, share this story. And if you want to hear more stories like Clara's stories that don't flinch from pain but walk through it toward justice, subscribe and stay with us. You are part of something bigger than a single story. Because every time we speak, every time we listen, every time we refuse to stay quiet, the world shifts a little. So leave a comment. Lend your voice. The tape never lies. But voices like yours make sure no one ever buries the truth again.